The Tyranids are one of the most urgent threats to humanity in the grimdark future of Warhammer 40,000. A swarm of engineered bioforms that descend on whole planets, consuming every shred of biomass. But they're also one of the most recent threats, arriving in the Milky Way galaxy only a few hundred years before the current in-game timeline. So in this video, let's look at their very first incursion, the initial discovery of the Tyranid menace, and the conflict that would become known as the First Tyrannic War. So in the world of Warhammer 40,000, the Imperium of Man is poised at the very start of its Fourth Tyrannic War. I mean, it's poised at the tip of a number of different wars, it's a busy place, but as far as the Tyranids are concerned, this is the fourth. And so I thought I'd go through the history of the three that preceded it, the incursions of the Hive fleets of Behemoth, Kraken, and Leviathan from the intergalactic void of space. The Tyranids in Warhammer are something of a new threat to the galaxy. Many of the factions and alien species that battle across the Milky Way have been locked in combat with each other and with mankind for millennia, ever since the first humans formed the first space empires thousands of years ago. But the Tyranids are something different, a bioengineered bug swarm arriving in greater and greater numbers from outside the bounds of our galaxy, each incursion taking a slightly different form as their great hive mind adapts its tactics and its biotechnologies to match the species it encounters. But the First Tyrannic War against the hive fleet that would become known as Behemoth was, in many ways, the most straightforward. A direct assault by a hive fleet whose tactics were just to brutally overrun everything in its path, and its fires were ignited soon after the official discovery of this new Xenos threat in the faraway Tyran system. Tyran was a system far to the galactic southeast, beyond the borders even of Ultramar and 60,000 light-years from Terra. On the very fringes of the Astronomicon and the frontier of the empty void, it was home to an ocean planet named Tyran Prime, designated an Adeptus Mechanicus research base, with a garrison of Skitarii and Astra Militarum and a small local fleet, all commanded by the Mechanicus Magos Varnak. In around 765 M41, Mechanicus explorator vessels had conducted a series of surveys on nearby planets, and what they found was troubling. Planets that had previously been recorded as being full of life were now lifeless rocks, all biological matter and resources stripped from them, with no evidence of where it went. These reports continued for the next decade, with expeditions venturing out from Tyran and from other places within the Imperium, but with no explanation. The reports were dutifully logged with the Imperial authorities, but that far out on the eastern fringe, no help was dispatched, and the dead worlds remained a mystery until, 10 years later, returning from an explorator mission, Varnak's fleet encountered a vast cloud of biomatter at the edge of the Tyran system. Unable to penetrate the mass with their Auspex, the Mechanicum fleet moved closer in to investigate, but their ships were damaged by strange, fleshy mines floating at the edges of the cloud. They managed to limp back to Tyran Prime days ahead of the cloud, out of which pulled larger objects, bio-ships, which then took up position in orbit and started to rain down spores and mines on the surface. But Tyran Prime was a frontier world, it wasn't defenseless. Its laser batteries opened fire on the bioships, forcing them to withdraw back into their cloud, and buoyed by their apparent victory, the Magos ordered his fleet to give chase. But as they pursued the remaining ships back through the cloud of spores, they discovered that the bioships that had assaulted the planet from orbit were just an advance guard. A dozen organisms had been killed from a fleet of thousands that lurked beyond the cloud. The Imperial fleet was slaughtered within minutes, their last broadcast warning Tyran Prime of the imminent threat. The planet itself lasted little longer. The defenders manned the walls and kept up a punishing rate of fire going with their defense lasers, but as the cloud enveloped the planet, thousands of spores crashed into the oceans, and a wave of horrific Xenos began to emerge from the depths, scaling the mountains and then the walls of the citadel. The defense laser emplacements fell silent, their defenders overrun by a tide of alien creatures, and within the hour, the base was lost. Varnak's last action was to secure all their records and findings into a data codex and secure it within a 3-kilometer deep bore shaft in the center of the base as a swarm of chittering aliens finally broke down the doors to the central chambers and overran the Magos and the last of the defenders. But reinforcement of a sort had already been dispatched. A conclave of the Ordo Xenos had been convened to investigate the decades of reports, and when they analysed these together, they came to 2 worrying conclusions: that there was an obvious pattern to these scoured worlds, and that pattern led directly towards the Explorator station at Tyran. Inquisitor Cryptman of the Xenos, along with a small fleet, was already en route to the Eastern Fringe when he received the final broadcast from Tyran months after the attack, but by the time he actually arrived on site, it was almost a year later, and the system, like all the others, was empty of life. The oceans of Tyran had been sucked dry and the world left a lifeless ruin, but it was only when Cryptman recovered the data codex that the Imperium laid eyes on this new threat for the first time. With no other references to go with, Cryptman named them after the planet. They were to be called the Tyranids. His first course of action was to attempt to warn the Imperial authorities of the Eastern Fringe of this new threat, this behemoth advancing on them. But the Inquisitor's accompanying astropath couldn't get through, reporting a darkness in the warp that blocked all communication, the first recorded instance of the shadow in the warp caused by the Hive fleets. The astropath attempted to make use of the relatively nearby astropathic relay station orbiting the mining world of Thandros, but that seemed to have gone dark too. So the fleet took to the warp again, burning hard for Thandros, on the way encountering more evidence of the Hive fleet's passing. The Imperial cruiser Investigation, floating dead in space with all hands lost, and the Oculus Observator Station, a moon-sized bio-artifact picked clean. And when they arrived at Thandros, they found the same. Thandros was a mining colony with few of the militarized defenses of somewhere like Tyran, and the tunnels of Thandros 2 and 3 were deserted, no survivors remaining. The orbiting Telepathica matrix had burned out its lasers and emptied its magazines before obviously being overrun. Salvaging the matrix, Cryptman's astropaths finally managed to contact the Imperium and relayed the Inquisitor his orders to proceed with haste towards the center of Ultramar, Macragge, the chapter planet of the Ultramarines, where he was to assist the chapter master Marneus Calgar in hunting down this new alien fleet. But while the inquisitorial ships had been pushing their way through a warp turbulent with the passing of the Hive fleet, Behemoth had continued its advance. The Tyranid swarm had spent eons in the empty void, and its hunger made it direct. The fleet continued on its northeasterly trajectory, heading directly for Ultramar and then the Imperium, but as it split into numerous separate tendrils, it had come into contact with other inhabitants of the Eastern Fringe. The Orc pirate enclave of Jagger, home to the famed Star Crumpers led by the freebooter Captain Blackgit, took a considerable toll on the Hive fleet as it paused to feed on the system. The kill cruisers of the Orcs dueling with Hive ships in the depths of space, but even the Orcs couldn't compete with the numbers of Behemoth, and the final Orc freebooters and Badgit himself were eventually consumed by Doom Ripper Kraken as they attempted to escape. Two tendrils of the fleet even approached the colossal Necron tomb world of Solemnus, ruled over by Trazyn the Infinite, but since the majority of the giant space museum was still in hibernation, without anything approaching signs of biological life, the tendrils passed it by without incident and eventually lapsed into a sort of hibernation. Meanwhile, Cryptman had raced through the warp, his navigator skillfully avoiding the weird eddies and undertows left by the passing of the fleet, and reached Macragge to find it heavily reinforced, with naval contingents arriving from across the nearby sectors and the Ultramarines' own ships having been recalled to the defense of Ultramar. By the time he was finally able to deliver his intelligence to the chapter master Marneus Calgar in the Ultramarines' fortress monastery, Behemoth was already burning its way through the outlying systems of Ultramar. Prandium was the first target, a verdant agri-world known as the Jewel of Ultramar. But even its legions of defense auxilia and formidable void defenses couldn't stand against the Hive fleet, and the Astra Militarum defenders was slaughtered to a man by wave upon wave of biological horrors. While some tendrils paused to feed on Prandium, more pushed onwards. One small fleet dropped spores onto the radioactive surface of Calth before rejoining the main body of the swarm, and the system of Sibari, actually a renegade holdout for the Death Shadows Chaos Warband, was consumed by Tyranid tendrils as their leader, the sorcerer Malafor, in the midst of planning his warband's next attack on Macragge, was driven even madder than normal by the looming shadow in the warp. Eventually, careening headlong through the Ultramarines' domain, the main body of the Hive Fleet arrived at Macragge. Drawn up against it were formidable defences, 200 ships of the Imperial Navy and Ultramarines, with more inbound from the Battlefleet Tempestus base at Bacca. Plus the planetary defences of Macragge itself, concentrated in its two massive polar defence fortresses studded with defence lasers. The Hive Fleet barely paused. Its first wave took horrific losses as they pushed straight through the defending fleet, its ships being meticulously destroyed by the defence lasers, but not before they released thousands of spores loaded with bioorganisms towards the surface. Initially, the Ultramarines and their auxiliaries, directed by Marneus Calgar, made good progress herding and eliminating the stampeding Tyranids that swept across the frozen plains and mountain ranges of Macragge, but the Hive Fleet soon adapted to their foe as a specific genus of leader organism emerged, known as the Swarm Lord. Amongst the few Imperial forces that caught sight of it, it seemed to be a bioform adapted for strategic control. And with it leading the advance, the Tyranids started to adapt to Calgar's tactics, bypassing the traps set for them, exploiting weak points in the Imperial defense with the skill of a military genius, and combining with other swarms until a huge concentration of Tyranids was advancing on the northern polar fortress. Calgar and the Ultramarines deployed to try and head them off in the Battle of Cold Steel Ridge, forming a cordon of trenches, but these were undermined by Raveners and Trigons, leading to a brutal secondary battle in the newly burrowed tunnels underneath. The Ultramarines deployed flamer arm teams to a subterranean assault, but this left the western flank of the defences under strength, just as the Swarm Lord had planned, and a herd of Carnifexes overran the armoured regiments of the Auxilia deployed in the west and broke through the line. Calgar, sensing that this battle had turned, sounded the retreat, intending to fall back from orbit, but the Swarm Lord tore across the battlefield, sending wave upon wave of organisms at the defenders to prevent them falling back, and finally attempted to kill Calgar himself. The Chapter Master fought like a hero of legend, but even he was laid low by the Tyrant and had to be extracted by his honour guard as the Tyranid swarm pressed on towards the northern fortress. When they eventually made it back to orbit, Calgar found that the situation was even more dire there. The first wave had mostly been destroyed, but the bioships just kept coming. By the third wave, the Ultramar defense fleet was in tatters, and by the time the Hive Fleet had launched its ninth wave of organisms, barely any of the orbital defences remained. The Imperial ships scattered as new swarms of bioforms were deployed to the surface. Calgar took command of the fleet, managing to reform the scattered defenders and forming them into a new assault, but the Hive Mind controlling Behemoth reacted in the same way it had at Tyran a year before. The bioships in the direct path of the Imperial counterattack fell back to the world of Circe at the edge of the system, where more Hive ships waited on the far side of the planet. But Calgar, realising this, took the bait anyway. As the Imperial fleet redirected towards Circe and the Hive Fleet parted way before them, and as the new swarm emerged from the far side of the planet, the Mandeville points at the edge of the system opened up, and Battlefleet Tempestus, inbound from Bacca, finally emerged. It was the Tyranids' turn to be caught in a trap as the Imperial reinforcements burned into the fray, fresh naval assets dueling with the bioships in the void above Circe and Macragge, until finally, deep in the heart of the Tyranid fleet, and with its escorts destroyed and its decks almost overrun, the Emperor-class battleship Dominus Astra detonated its warp drives. The resulting rift that blinked into existence in the void took out the center of the cloud of organisms. The biggest bioforms in the fleet sucked screaming into the Immaterium, and the heart ripped out of Behemoth. Returning to Macragge, the Ultramarines found only devastation, especially around the two polar fortresses. In the southern fortress, some survivors still remained, but in the northern fortress, the assaulting Tyranids and the defending First Company of the Ultramarines had fought each other to mutual destruction in its tightly packed corridors and emplacements. The headlong charge that was Behemoth ended there, but the remnants of the Hive Fleet continued to plague the area for years to come. Both Macragge and Calth took years to finally purge of Tyranid bioforms, with hundreds of the Xenos rallying to the side of a one-eyed Carnifex in the tunnels beneath the surface of Calth. And Ultramarine scouts and veterans led missions across the segmentum for decades after in search of rogue swarms. Giant bioships assaulted the forge world of Annamheim, allowing heretic Astartes to capitalize on the disruption and assault the Mechanicum stronghold while its forces were in the void, and the nearby Mortifactors chapter suffered 90% losses attempting to destroy another lone ship. Whole splinter fleets made it even further into the Imperium, one reaching as far as the Nephilim sector and coming into contact with the Raven Wing of the Dark Angels chapter, and another assaulting and devouring the Eldar Maiden world of Shao Yor. Despite the presence of engines of Vol deployed by the craft world Bieltan, the remnants of the Hive Fleet continued to evolve throughout this, with many new strains emerging. In fact, within a century, the Ordo Xenos and the Adeptus Mechanicus Magos Biologists had started to covertly study captured bioforms in an attempt to understand this new enemy on the world of Beta Amphelion 4, a project which predictably ended in disaster for all involved when the Tyranids escaped containment, the Red Scorpions sent to investigate the site, stranding the rest of the research team on the planet with the rampaging Xenos. The Ultramarines themselves would take centuries to recover. They were unable to field a complete first company for almost a century and didn't officially replace their losses until 861 M41, 116 years later. And in all that time, remnants of Behemoth were still being encountered, or at least that's what the Imperium thought. In reality, the first elements of a new Hive Fleet were just starting to arrive from the cold depths of intergalactic space. The Hive Fleet that would eventually be named Kraken and start a totally different sort of Tyrannic War. But that's a story for another video. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to hear more about the events of Warhammer 40k, then click on the little link to the right there. You can also join the Patreon or the Discord for early access to videos and the ability to vote on the videos. And if you want to buy me a gribbly horde of my own, there's some links to affiliate stores in the thing below. See ya.